Welcome to the show. I'm Madelyn Blair, and this is Unlocked, a show all about opening and building the resilient leader in you. We all know what the word brand means, but what about the word embodiment? Would you believe they are tightly related? My guest, Terrence Gargiulo, is going to explore that, along with what it means in your workplace. And our final segment today is Grounds for Thought, an extension of the talk. So stay tuned to see what's brewing. Today, we're diving into a fascinating concept, embodiment. You know, the word embodiment isn't just any typical word. It carries profound depth and richness. Think of embodiment as a tangible or visible form of an idea, a quality, or even a feeling. For example, I've been told that I embody resilience. Not just because I've researched and written extensively about it, but because my actions consistently reflect the essence of a resilient person. Embodiment can also mean visually representing something in a tangible form. I vividly remember standing at the head of the table, poised to deliver my presentation to the board, feeling fully capable of embodying the leader I aspired to become. In another sense, to embody means to personify an ideal in human or even animal form. And to me, Nelson Mandela has always embodied the spirit of hope and perseverance. Living through our senses is another dimension of embodiment. I don't know if you watch Queer Eye, but I watch it occasionally. Imagine Anthony, who experiences the world viscerally through the taste and smell of food, his senses bringing the essence of life into his body. I truly love words that offer such deep, layered meanings, even if they can be a bit perplexing at times. Today, we're going to explore what it means to embody our brand and identity through the stories we tell. Joining us is an extraordinary individual, a longtime friend and a storytelling guru, Terrence Gargiulo. So get comfortable and prepare to unlock the secrets of embodiment and see how it shapes your personal and professional journey. Terrence Gargiulo is more than just a storyteller. He's a master narrative transformation person. As president of MakingStories.net, Terrence leverages over 20 years of international learning and development experience with Fortune 500 companies. Terrence is a sought-after speaker, captivating audiences at both national and international conferences with his insights and expertise. He is the acclaimed author of 8 books, including the influential The Strategic Use of Stories in Organizational Communication and Learning, and the transformative one, In the Land of Difficult People, 24 Timeless Tales Reveal How to Tame Beasts at Work. I love that second title. I want to find that book one of these days. His illustrious career includes pivotal roles such as the former chief storyteller at Accenture, where he built a global team of storytelling coaches. Terrence has earned numerous awards for his work in the art of storytelling. Join us as we delve into the world of narrative with a true expert who understands the profound impact of stories on the personal and professional development. And here he is. Terrence, welcome to Unlocked.
Thank you, Madelyn. And I don't know, do you remember actually the first time that we met? Because it is so much in line with your introduction about words. So this is your first quiz question. Do you remember, not even, you probably didn't even know I was there, but do you have a guess as to the first time that we were co-located around storytelling?
Okay, it was probably at one of the conferences in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
It was either at the Smithsonian or it was at the Golden Fleece. You
It
have
was
to
at
tell
it
me.
was at Smithsonian, and
Okay.
it made such an
Oh,
impact.
it was on conversation.
Yes.
Ah,
And you did this beautiful talk about the power of words
yeah.
and how working just with the UN and a mission statement. Do you remember this?
I
Can
do
you
now. Oh, yes.
share this story? Because then I'm going to tie it immediately into embodiment and we're going to dive into all this great stuff.
Oh, fabulous. I haven't thought about that in a long time. And that was actually one of my favorite talks because I remember the first time I looked at the word conversation. I always think of it as two people talking back and forth, and it isn't. It really means to turn around with. And I was like, wow, turn around with. That gives me a whole different feeling of it. Well, okay, we could digress. We must come back to embodiment.
Yes.
But thank you for remembering that. That was such a great time. I really enjoyed that series of conferences that went on
Yes.
for
Very,
what, about 10 years? Yeah,
right. Right.
a year.
Right.
All right. So, Terrence, why don't we begin with how do we embody our stories? Talk to me about that.
Oh my gosh, you started to break it down, and when I immediately thought of my father, who was a conductor. And I remember being in a rehearsal as a young child, and there was one point where he made his introduction in the following way. He said, good morning, thank you for being here, all of the things that you expect us in civility for us to do. And then he says, if I can't communicate with this, we're all in trouble. And then he began the rehearsal. And there were moments when he put the baton down and just with his eyes, he took 60 plus musicians and translated the emotion, the interpretation, the inspiration, really what our resilient leaders are doing every day, right? Because it's not one or two women or men that show up that lead the organization. It's us leading others to lead. And so you can imagine him being able to do that simply through the embodiment, the intentionality, the love that came through his eyes, as well as the command and knowledge. And so, that has always struck me as a way of seeing the power of embodiment in just a very unique way, right? Music is so powerful.
Yes, and the idea that you could see an instant reflection of that because the orchestra had to play together.
Right, right. Now, what do you think about people that have deal with horrible things like PTSD? How do we see embodiment? What have been your observations of people that you've known that have been through very traumatic things, and what do we see in their behaviors? What do you notice?
Oh gosh, that's a really powerful question. I've got to think about that. Um, the word that comes to mind is wariness.
Mm.
You see something about, in other words, their eyes flit because they're checking out the environment. Or am I am I safe? Am I still safe? That's what comes to my mind.
Yes, very much so. I think that not feeling safe, not feeling secure, and with due respect to people that have trauma, it's never going to show itself in exactly the same way.
Like,
And yet we all know when we see someone being triggered by anxiety or trauma, it's very dramatic. Likewise, we see when that angry person comes into the room, they've just been in a one-on-one conversation, and what do you see when they walk into, let's say, a group meeting? It's immediately personified in their body. And so I know you've coached lots of leaders. What have you done as far as resilience and saying to a leader, hey, if you see someone walk into the room and they're embodying some form of negative emotion what can you do as a leader to facilitate so that that experience for everyone can maybe be in a healthy place and in a more positive beginning as opposed to being negatively impacted?
Terrence, you're doing a great job interviewing me.
Well, you're the resilient expert. I
Now, this is a great, great issue because leaders really often don't think about the fact that even one person who is incredibly upset can literally trigger that kind of feeling in a room. In fact, we had earlier, a couple of weeks ago, we had Bruce Cryer on, who was the one of the founders of HeartMath,
Mhm.
who that looked at that from a scientific perspective. Um, and the fact that they proved that when you come in with that kind of chaotic uh, chaos going on inside of you, that seeps out to other people. So, from a leader's perspective, I often, if they're doing this kind of thing all the time, I do some help them with some prep work so that when they go in, they are at least calm, so that they can, in other words, kind of counterbalance that kind of chaotic thing. But
Right.
the other is to make a choice as to whether that person is. It is so important that they be present in the right manner or not. And if it is important, then the leader has to know how to address that person to diffuse that anger, not
Absolutely.
necessarily overtly. So
Well,
that's
and it's a meaningful moment opportunity. So, there is that kind of triaging. If it's a meeting of 50 people, you may not, and because of
right.
an agenda, you may not
You
have
wouldn't do that. That's right.
luxury. If it's a smaller meeting, it's an opportunity to demonstrate care and intention and how one of the things I'm going to talk about when we kind of try to put some practical, hey, here are some next steps for people, is I'm going to say you need to be an EMT. And the E is about eliciting. And so here in this situation, you have this trauma going on. Someone comes in, they've had a bad moment, whether it's a personal thing or it's something that's happened at work. There's negative energy, and you painted a great picture. You said it's chaos. There's disorder, and disorder doesn't allow anybody to synergize, to function well, to be at their best. And so, what we want to do is find a safe way to elicit and surface what it is, what might be bothering them. And in fact, there's ways that you can ask questions to get them to share their, their story, and perhaps link it to other people's experiences at the moment. I think of it this way. I remember it was shortly after 9/11, and everyone's really, really tense. And so all of us were walking around into every single meeting with a sense of insecurity. Or we don't have to go back as far as 9/11. We can talk about COVID as we all dealt with that uncertainty, even in our virtual meetings. So taking a minute to check in, to elicit from people, and if you show that care, you often can curtail it to make sure I didn't ask you to give me a 10-minute story. But I do want to know what just happened to you that's bothering you. Did you just run a red light and you got a ticket, and this is your third ticket and you have to go to traffic school, and you don't have either the time to do that, and you're feeling really horrible about what just happened? So and then other people can chime in. Yeah, I recently got a parking ticket, and it just destroyed my whole day. And so now there's this common ground that emerges, and they've seen you act as a leader that cares about others. That creates community care and builds resilience at the again at the collective level.
Well, in fact, that's a very good point because one of the characteristics of highly resilient people is that they have good social support. And those kinds of actions on the part of the leader actually helps the organization itself to build those kinds of social supports for each other.
Yes. Yeah. And we have to be very disciplined as leaders in eliciting and saying, so what's behind that? I'm noticing that emotion. It's really, I haven't seen it yet. I don't know. They've got this new movie out, Inside Out 2.
Oh, yes, I heard about it, but I haven't watched it either.
I'm looking forward to it because they've done the personification of these emotions, right? And that's really kind of what we're talking about. And just one other quick example to help people step into this really odd, as you said, it's really an odd word, embodiment. How do I do that? And how is that showing up with stories and all the stuff? In the Greek literature, they have these ridiculous, bloody, horrible, gory battles, like in the Odyssey, in the Iliad, right? But they always talk about Aristia. They talk about the moment when Athena stands on the shoulder of the soldier, and they're filled with confidence, because you talked about that too. They're filled with presence and confidence, and they can stand up. In this case, they're standing up in battle, and nobody can touch them. And I was an athlete, and so this whole idea of when the momentum turns, when you're in the flow, when you're in the zone, and when you're coming forward with your integrated self with passion, you're embodying that. And we see that in athletes. It's one of the reasons that we love watching athletes. We love that personification of the heroine and the hero as they step into their fullest, and that they're being successful and they're doing it so effortlessly. So being filled with Aristia is the embodiment of that confidence, of that effectiveness.
I had forgotten about Aristia. Thank you for reminding me. Well, now that's a perfect example of embodiment on the battlefield, or the embodiment on the sports field. So what does it mean to be the embodiment of something in the workplace?
Yeah.
That's one of the questions, by the way, that the teenagers came up with.
So, and you said it well in your introductions, actions speak louder than words. That you didn't explicitly use that cliche, but you talked about the power of actions. One of the stories that never left me, it was very influential in sort of saying how a leader shows up immediately, are these two examples. One is that when Pope Francis came into his papacy, he did two things. One, he would not take the big fancy limousine back to his little pensione. He, in humility, he walked.
Yeah.
And the second thing he did is he invited everyone to pray with him.
Yeah.
And so again, I'm not trying to make a religious statement here to anyone, but here was a global leader stepping into a role, and he enacted versus announced with his intentions humility, powerful humility. And he didn't have to say, I want to be a humble pope. I want people to talk and collaborate with one another. No, he did it by his actions. Here's another one. This one, I have to admit, I was a bit of a trickster and involved in this one. But this is what storytellers do. There was a manufacturing division. They had done very, very, very well, and they were going to have like a big luncheon to celebrate. But the fact of the matter was they were entering into these first 2 quarters with new products, and there were defects happening left and right. And in fact, from after having this really huge success, there was suddenly all these problems. There was all this finger pointing going on. Quality assurance thought it was, the production people. The production people thought it was the design people. No one was solving the problem. So what we decided to do at the luncheon was to purposely mess up people's orders. So they were given, they were sent, tell us, do you want the lasagna? You want the, veggie sandwich? What do you want for lunch? And put your name on it. And then we had the catering company purposely mess everything up.
Oh, tell me what happened. What? Don't leave me hanging.
Suddenly, they got it. So when he then came up to begin giving his little spiel about, hey, we've had this great quarter, just want to thank everyone for all their hard work, blah, 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 blah. He then didn't have to say, and we're stepping into our new quarter. Oh, by the way, and as he started the speech, everyone had the wrong lunches and everyone was really discombobulated, as you would expect. And then he said, "Oh, could you please use what we faxed?" This was in the days of fax. I know I'm dating myself, but can you please use what we faxed you this morning? That's the correct seating, because there was a seating chart, right, where everyone was seated. So then suddenly people started getting the right lunches. So he's like, I hope we can all communicate and coordinate with one another as we step in with this new product. And that's all he had to say. That's all he had to say. So two takeaways, right? One, in our first example, it's about realizing that we enact. We need, if we want to embody the things, let's say it's things from our mission statement. Hey, we are a culture that takes interest in others. We put people first. Okay, well, show me behaviors that embody those things. And then you can take that, of course, down to the individual level, because I know we talk about resiliency as it relates to personal brand. Okay, so who is Madelyn? Who is Terrence? Oh, Terrence is this really strategic guy with his heart on his sleeve, really passionate, and blah, blah, blah. So how do I bring that forward? Oh, well, I proactively know that Madelyn loves cappuccinos. She's a great chef. And if I bring her this really wonderful infused olive oil, like, we're going to have this great conversation about recipes and we're going to be able to really work well this morning, right? So I embody it through my actions. And the second is to realize that we can be intentional with our actions as it relates to setting other people up for success. And so how are we going the extra mile, not just to think about the clarity of our communications, but planning our actions and being flexible with our actions? Because part of planning actions is like being a good jazz musician. It's saying, okay, I got this idea, but now I need to walk into this room ready to take actions. So let me give you a quick example, and then I'll ask you, because I bet you've got some good examples too. This might trigger one for you. You begin going down a topic area on an agenda, and you suddenly recognize that there's probably another person in the room that has maybe more experience, maybe from a different organization, maybe a different point of view. And so you immediately push that person forward in the conversation. You say, hey, could you take a minute and come up and help us think through, frame it for them, so set them up for success. You don't want it so big, open-ended, they're like a deer in a headlight. So it would be something very, very specific. Madelyn, you've worked at the United Nations, and you've worked with facilitating disagreements around policy. Would you be able to help lead us in a conversation around 3 to 4 guidelines of how you structure a conversation around policy disagreements, right? And then you might say, and can you take 10 minutes to help us frame 3 to 5 guidelines for how to structure difficult conversations around policy where there are very different opinions in the room. Okay, so frame it and set it up for success. Let me throw that back to you. What are things that you've done or seen that are actions around this kind of idea of embodiment?
I have one of my favorite examples. When I worked with, I'm now retired from Columbia University, but when I was working with students there, I always worked with them in teams, because I was the mentor to what's called the capstone course. It's the ending course of their program, where they actually work with a real organization to solve a problem. And I would say, we have to work together as a team. I'd like each of us to describe a time when you were working in a team that was absolutely fantastic, and tell a story about that so I can understand your experience. Well, we would get to the end, and I would say, okay, this is what I heard. And I will list the things like, we all speak honestly to each other. We don't try to undercut each. I mean, there were all kinds of things that came out. I said, we need some ground rules for how we will work together. Let's start with this list. Which of these do you want to, as a group, abide by? Invariably, they would do the whole thing. And they became really effective teams. Why? Because they knew each one of those things was real. The person had described it as a personal thing. And because it was real to somebody, it was real. And it worked.
That's so visceral. So we begin in the space of imagination.
Mm-hmm.
We take curiosity, we elicit their experiences. Those experiences are something that they want to embody, particularly if they were positive ones. In this case, you were asking something that was in a positive vein.
Mm-hmm.
Others, even if they don't share their stories, are going, well, that's kind of something like what happened to me. And wow, that's something that I want to embody too. Then you brought them to a place of thematics, of basically saying, here's what we heard in each other's experiences, AKA stories.
Mm-hmm.
And oh my gosh, we have all this common ground and they're feeling it. So the power of storytelling and embodiment is in the space of imagination, our imagination and our collective imagination, because it's like a virtual reality simulator. You suddenly can taste it, think, feel it. You're reconstituting it. It's coming back to you. And when we then can share those, it's like a bunch of little shimmering stars that suddenly, get close to one another and they start sparking light back and forth. It creates a network of meaning that is one that we can all act upon, even as we act individually.
I love that image of the what did you call them, little stars?
Little stars, shimmering stars.
Yeah. I think my teams always became stars. and it was that you're right, they actually created something new by the fact that they saw each other through this particular light and created something for themselves that was uniquely theirs, and therefore it worked. It worked.
It's recombinant DNA.
Yes.
It's emerging. And here's another. I know I'm like throwing out all kinds of buzzwords, but we're geeking out because that's what we love geeking out about.
Well, as long as you will translate for the audience.
I will. Living story. So the individual stories come to something that then everybody's looking at each other because they're now feeling. We're not just in the head, and we're not even just in the emotion of the heart. I like to say we're in the head, the heart, and the gut, or the soul itself. And so now everybody's in this place of potentiality and everybody is turned on. And then when all that energy is turned on, it's kind of like the two strands of DNA. It takes a lot of energy to unzip them. But then when they unzip, they can kind of recombine. And when they recombine, something new is also generated. It might be replicated, but also something new it happens. And that's that emergence, or that becomes the living story. Because like with your group of students, they all say, wow, we now own together X, Y, and Z as how we are going to act as a group. And you know what? It also becomes accountability. It becomes a referential point for everyone to say, hey, remember you told that story about how it was important to be authentic because you did X, Y, and Z, and it's tied to a personal experience. And so you have permission, and you also have a lingua, if you will. You have a language of shared story, of shared sense making that allows you to be collectively accountable to one another in a very safe way. Because if I call back your story, I'm respecting your story. And I'm saying, isn't this still important to you?
Yeah.
So I'm not saying you have to comply and do X, Y, and Z, because nobody wants to feel like, something's been pressed on them willfully that they have to just be in compliance with. We all want to feel like we're committed to things. And that's what you've done with that group of students, and that, what you've characterized for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, I had to say hardly anything about how they worked together because they just did it. I think there was only one case I won't say what happened because he'll know exactly that I'm talking about.
Okay.
But there was somebody who slipped away at a critical moment,
Okay.
and he had checked it out with everybody else, but had not checked it out with me. So he got a little bit of a reprimand.
Okay. That's important.
That's important. That's important. That's right. That's part of my job. Well,
Constraints and
as
boundaries.
we're talking about this, I'm realizing how incredibly important it is, especially in a business setting where you really depend on the work of groups of people, how incredibly important it is that we be aware of what we are embodying as we live in that organization. Sometimes we reveal it through stories, and as you say, we also reveal it through our actions. So
I got one more. I'm sorry. I got one more little anecdote.
you can
I
do
didn't
it.
tell you, but it's a good anecdote. And I'll also be able to tie it how this person's personal story led to his action and the action and the result of his action on me. So it was early in my career, and we were working to set up I was working for an insurance company, and they were migrating from IBM Profs. Profs was a framework that was used for setting up messaging and calendaring and kind of early computing between people inside of an organization. And we were suddenly going to be giving them Windows machines and all of this kind of thing. And there was going to be a class, and the class involved at a hotel us setting up all of these machines that had to be networked to one another. Now, try to put this in perspective. We're really talking about like 1996. So this is very, very early networking days. This guy who was in charge of the project, showed up. He helped us unpack everything, and then we started setting up the network. And this was like early in the afternoon. Well, we started having problems. We couldn't get all the machines to work, and we were trying to problem solve this. And it's like 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. This guy's not leaving. He goes and grabs us. We were in Maine, and he goes and grabs us lobster roll sandwiches and beer, and he stays with us. Okay, turns out this guy had been a lieutenant colonel and had been in Desert Storm, and he would never leave his troops in any kind of situation and or ask them to do anything that he himself wouldn't also do. And so there he was. This was his experience in the past. And just because this was a corporate environment, and even though he didn't know how to do any of the work that we had to do, he wasn't going to leave us. He was going to stay there with us. And if that just meant getting us lobster rolls and beers, then that's what he would do. And to this day, here I am still sharing that story. And how many times do I see, oh, I'd really rather not do X, Y, or Z. I don't want to have to photocopy. I don't have to stay till 7, 8 o'clock photocopying what we need for the workshop tomorrow morning. No, I'm going to stay and help this person collate and staple what we need for the workshop tomorrow morning, even though it's not in my job description, because I have been touched by someone else's embodied story.
Mm, that is really a beautiful story. And it also reminds me of how delicious lobster rolls are in New York. Like
Now I'm all about Dungeness crab. Okay, I
it's
live in
pretty good,
Monterey.
but there's nothing like a Maine
Nothing like
lobster roll. You know, I used to live in Maine, so that was part of my early times.
Okay.
All right. I think we've touched on this. How does embodied imagination through the natural power of stories cultivate resilience? You haven't talked about that.
Yeah. And let me touch upon this in another dimension. So I want to talk about, sometimes obviously we need to persevere in our connections with others. And so I'm going to talk about imagination as something that we give the gift to others. So what do I mean by that? Is you're seeing someone struggle in some way or another. How many times do you say to yourself, what's the story behind that story? What's the story behind what I'm experiencing or feeling from this person? Now, let's be honest. Sometimes we do, but we're very utilitarian and say, but I don't really care what their story is. We just need to get the job done. And I want to respect that. There are times where we simply do have to be transactional. Not everything is kumbaya and sit down around the fire and enjoy the story. So I want to be very respectful. But I'm gonna focus on the side that says, what if I project myself in their shoes? How do I do that? And that's the space of imagination that leads to resiliency of our connections with others. It also strengthens us to say that I'm confident enough in my own brand, in who and how I am, to not personally be, rubbed the wrong way by the fact that, Madelyn right now is exhibiting X, Y, or Z. I want to, if I don't do it actively by asking you a question, Madelyn, I'm noticing such and such and such. Is there something that you might, is there something, anything that you want to share? Is there anything we need to think about together? Again, always try to use language and questions that are safe and that, respect the integrity of others. We have a whole ethics around storytelling, which is, people don't always want to share their stories, even as we see bits and pieces of their story. So, just as a side note, a sidebar for a second, one of the best ways of building trust is giving a little bit of your own vulnerability. So, oftentimes in those situations, even if it's in a sentence or two, I might try to give a little bit of my own vulnerability, because that's almost like an offering to say, is there something that you'd like to share that maybe you wouldn't in this situation, but I do care. I am interested if you want to share.
You know,
So
I have to
go.
digress.
Yeah.
Your comment about vulnerability and story. Oftentimes, when I talk about story with groups, I say to them, a person's personal story is a little piece of themselves. It's sort of like they go into their closet and they pull out something and they say, "This is what I wear on Sundays." It's a piece of who they are, and you have to respect that. That's a part of them. It can be very intimate and very telling. And yet, as you're suggesting, it builds incredible bonds of connection between people.
That's such a beautiful metaphor of their clothes. They've gone into um, their small their closet inside of their bedroom, which is not a place where others go into. They've taken a piece of clothing that they've owned for a number of years. They're wearing it. That really does bring forward this metaphor of embodiment, and how we are to respect it. I'm going to give a little example. This was just yesterday. I was talking to my sister, and my sister had been, um, and this will model several things on lots of different levels. My sister was getting her hair done, and my sister and I are taking good care of my 92-year-old mom, who's transitioning a little bit into a little bit more vulnerability after being someone who has always been on top of everything for everyone and never helpless, always making everyone else feel helped and doing it in such an effortless way. Now, because of Parkinson's and scoliosis and life and aging, really needs a fair amount of help. So, anyway, my sister's at a hair appointment, and my mom has a need, one that I can't do completely by myself. So I call my sister and tell her of the situation, and my sister says, "Okay, you don't need to blow dry my hair. I just need to get home and help my brother." Okay, so this hair place, which has been a dear friend of the family for a long time, one of her one of her people that works for her was the one doing my sister's hair. And this person says, "Oh, don't worry about it. Just come back another time. I'll give you a free blow," because the hair appointment is not necessarily cheap. It's not the $15 instant cut place. It's a hair place, so it's not cheap. So he says, "Just come back, and I'll be happy to give you a blow dry. Give you hair dry later." And so then, as my sister was leaving, the other woman who's in charge, who's also a dear friend of the family, kind of says to Franca, you know, that's not our policy. And we don't do that. But I guess just for you this one time, we'll do it. And my sister was sharing the story with me in a way of like, oh, that kind of hurt. So now here's the imagination piece. You know, first to be present with my sister and that pain. I'm modeling a vulnerability by saying something to an unknown audience about a situation in my own life. So there's the vulnerability. And now putting ourselves through imagination into someone else's shoes, I said, well, Franco, you know, I wonder what it's like to have, this is in Carmel, California, and Carmel, California has really a lot of wonderful, but maybe at times people who have high expectations of what they're supposed to get. And I said, you know, what would it be the owner of that place that has people making demands all the time, you know? And is it possible that, you know, they even forgot about the intimate family relationship that we have with them and also wanted to model to their own employee that, hey, we have to be careful about this. And so we stepped into a place of imagination, right? And we embodied and felt what it might be for her. And in doing that, it gave my sister an opportunity to kind of sigh and have some compassion. This is the reason why imagination with others brings us to a place of compassion. Compassion naturally creates resiliency because it gets us to a space of peace. We can be at peace with ourselves as opposed to feeling in fight mode because someone attacked us. Oh, they're not going to blow dry our hair. Oh, they're not going to, you know, be considerate of us when we have a situation. It takes us out of that fear mode and puts us in a place of vulnerable common care and common ground.
Beautiful. I think you've pulled all the threads together very nicely. All right, I have one last question.
Okay.
Now I'm gonna. This is the tough one.
Oh no.
Tell me 3 things that I can begin doing today to get in touch with my embodiment, so that
Okay.
it's more intentional.
Okay. And it's a good thing that we kind of said, you better come up with 3 things and I'll ask you at the end. and I want to put it into EMT because I
Okay.
want you to think of it as like emergency medical treatment, because really how we show up in organizations so that we can show with our best brand, our best authentic selves, so that we can be resilient and we can help others be resilient. We need to think of it as emergency medical treatment. And so the E is about eliciting. E is taking this care, and whether you do it actively through a set of questions, observations, or even through your own stop, think, and imagine about this other person. So it could happen on any of those levels. The obvious one is I ask you a question, which elicits you to share an experience and gives me insight as to why you are acting or why you are feeling the way that you are. And by the way, we should do this with ourselves as well, which comes to our second one, which is make time for reflection. Review your day. We talk about, in my tradition, we talk about an examination of conscience, which is go back through. What were the moments where I was a louse? Because there were, you know, either in thought, you know, but remember, thought, it's not far from thought to how someone picks up on you. We're not, we feel like we're in these boxes that we call self, and that no one can know what's going on in these heads. But that's why that movie Inside Out 2 is probably going to be really good, because it shows that these things do act out. And just like the person from the Heart Math Institute, you know, talking about how this is really measurable. It is in the bodies. So examination of conscience. And then also I like to talk about appreciate those blessings of the day, but make time for reflection. And the last of the EMT is tag meaningful actions. And what I mean by that is when you are going to do something, such as this guy who had the lobster rolls, and he says, so I'm like, why are you still here? Well, he had a tag for his action. His tag for his action was, I've been literally in the trenches with men and women. And there's no way, since I was going to leave them. They needed to know that we had each other's backs. Okay, so he had a tag for his. So when I asked, why are you doing this? There was a tag. Are we tagging our own things that are important to us? If we always show up to some, I know this is a silly example, but if I always show up to a house with a bouquet of flowers, do I have a tag for that? Well, I'll never forget my great grandmother, the story of my great grandmother, who always, even when she had nothing, would go into her garden and pick a flower because she so appreciated when someone made a meal. That lived with my mom living through the Depression, blah, 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 right? So tag meaningful actions, tag your experiences. EMT, elicit, make time for reflection, and tag.
Excellent. I like that EMT. Especially, I like the reflection part. I think we spend too little time reflecting these days. Well, speaking of reflecting, Terrence, this has been such a wonderful conversation. It's allowed me, as you're talking, to reflect on many, many earlier pieces in my life. So thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Every now and then, there is something that changes how I think about the world. Grounds for Thought is a place where I talk about these moments so that you can explore the meaning for yourself. Today's Grounds for Thought is based on what I learned from a book called If I Understood You, Would I Have This Look on My Face? By Alan Alda. The more I thought about embodiment, the more I realized how important it is to observe and listen to our friends, family, and work colleagues. And Terrence did a beautiful job of describing that. But the better we do that, the better we appreciate who they embody, the better we will understand ourselves and what actions and behaviors become signals to others. And as I thought about this, it reminded me of my early exposure to acting principles. And then suddenly I recalled the book by Alan Alda. As you might suspect, the book is fun to read. His style of humor seeps out. He is indeed a comedian even when he writes. There was one exercise he talks about in the book that I loved when I first read it, and it came to mind again as I thought about learning how to observe and listen. I've actually done this exercise many times, and it is fun. It's in chapter 4, just in case you're interested. It's called the mirror exercise, and he describes it at 3 levels. He puts people in groups of 2. You have a pair. One person is called the leader, and the leader does something, and the follower, or the other person, I'll just call them, does the same thing. They mirror it. So if the leader raises their hand, the follower raises their hand, or whatever. Now, what happens is, at first, it's kind of disjointed. The other person watches, oh, I got to go here, I got to do this. And pretty soon, it becomes like a dance. They move almost simultaneously. And when they get to that point, Alan says, okay, swap roles. Leader, you're no longer the leader, and the other person is. And they start the same exercise again. And they fumble around at first because they're used to doing it the other way, but then pretty soon they're doing it simultaneously, like a dance. Then he says, okay, you did that pretty well. Now, do this same exercise, but neither of you are the leader. He says, this one takes a little longer to kind of smooth out, but eventually they actually begin to anticipate movements and move together. The lesson, he says, is that the person who's communicating something is responsible for how well the other person follows them. I loved that. Your job when you're communicating is to be a good way for the other person to actually follow. And it actually gets to the point where if you communicate well enough, other people begin to read your mind. And I can tell you that really does happen. All right, then there's another exercise. This one is on verbal synchronization. Similar kind of situation. You're in a pair and one person speaks some kind of improvisational content. They may be talking about a video that they saw that was really great and they're trying to describe it to this other person. Or it might be a meal that they had that they loved. And the job of the other person is to not mimic the speaker, but to anticipate the words so that pretty soon it's as if one person is speaking. And believe it or not, people actually learn to do that. I have never been able to do that all the way to the end where we really get synchronized. Maybe the facilitator didn't give us enough time. I don't know. But it's hard to do because you're thinking about what are they doing? What am I thinking? What could they possibly be thinking? And then eventually you get into a flow where you do become simultaneous, but it means lots of observing, lots of listening. I mean, all of your senses are attuned. I think the amazing thing about acting exercises is that they often are directly applicable to working in a business setting. And although these exact exercises won't be, well, unless maybe if you're on a retreat and the facilitator decides to use them. But what does happen is that you find that you are really able to become more observant of everything around you. You begin to read texts with subtleties. And over time, you even begin to observe yourself more deeply. I've often worked with managers where they were trying to shift themselves into a new stance, a new embodiment. And I would say to them, don't worry. At first, you're going to observe things after you've done what you didn't want to do. And then you're going to observe it and see it right when you're in the moment. I said, but eventually, you are going to see it before you do it, and then you can change that action. I think that acting principles, acting exercises are remarkably powerful when you bring them into the business setting in terms of simply understanding how you work and how you move. For those of you who have pursued a career for many years, you likely already adroitly do this. But if you're early in your career, or if you have been narrowly focused in your career, you've only worked with a certain kind of individual, perhaps it was just you only worked with programmers or you only worked with doctors, your behavior patterns are narrow to those, and you want to expand it. This skill is very important to learn. Embodiment is real, and our actions and behaviors reflect who we are. Learning how to observe yourself as well as you observe others is powerful. It's often one of the first things I work on with managers. If I understood you, would I have this look on my face? By Alan Alda. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you learned something and maybe even changed something that you're thinking of doing. And if you have a question, please, I love talking with people and exploring whatever questions you might have or issues. Just go to my website and you can schedule a free conversation. And of course, if you're on YouTube, please click the like button. And you can even subscribe. That would be great. Thank you so much for being with me. I'm Madelyn Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilient leader.